Well, hello and welcome to our webinar on how to write a strong research proposal for your PhD. We're really pleased that you could join us. Firstly, let me introduce myself. I'm Jonathan Lloyd. I work in the university's graduate school, and I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Rachel Foxley, Director of Postgraduate Research Studies in our Department of History, Professor Faustina Huang, Director of Postgraduate Research Studies in our School of Biological Sciences, and Andre Donnels, PhD researcher, also from the School of Biological Sciences. So we thought we'd briefly outline what we're intending to cover in this webinar. We'd like to offer some advice to help you understand more about what is expected in a good PhD research proposal. There are quite significant differences between what's expected from a proposal in the arts and humanities and social sciences and what is expected in a proposal from the sciences. So for that reason, we've asked Rachel to provide some guidance for a proposal in the arts and humanities and social sciences areas, and Faustina to provide some guidance on the science areas. After Rachel has shared with us, then we'll move on to Andre, who's going to provide a student's perspective, and then we'll ask Faustina to share before we move on to some of your questions at the end. So just before we move to our first speaker, if you are interested in asking any questions, there are some instructions on a slide, which is there. If you've joined the webinar using a PC, then you should have a tab on the right hand of your screen, which you can expand to ask questions. If you're listening to the webinar from your phone, you should have the option to raise your hand, after which you can submit your question. So do feel free to submit your questions throughout the webinar. We'll try and answer as many questions as we can at the end. So I'd like to invite Rachel to start us off by providing some information about a research proposal for the arts, humanities and social sciences. So thank you, Rachel.
Thanks very much, John. Obviously, there are some differences between arts, humanities and social sciences proposals, but I'm going to speak in a way that should be relevant to all of them. And hopefully at some point in this process, you're going to be in dialogue with potential supervisors in your subject area in any case. So if you have any more specific questions about appropriate methodologies, for example, for your particular area, hopefully there will be people that you can talk to eventually as you put your PhD proposal together. Your PhD proposal is really important for a number of reasons, and we're looking for various things when we read your PhD proposal. Obviously, and firstly, most importantly, it does tell us what you're interested in studying. And it is always worth remembering when you're on this part of your academic journey, finding your way towards a PhD, that it's about finding the right fit as well as about finding the right project. So we do need to be able to supervise it. So your proposal tells us what you're interested in, and we can find out whether we have a supervisor who will be interested in supervising that project. It also tells us why you think your topic is important and why it's viable as a PhD. There are some great projects that wouldn't be PhDs because they might just be too big or too difficult to tackle with the available resources. But it also tells us things about you as well as about your project. And that enables us to make a good academic judgment of where you are and whether you're ready for the PhD. So it shows us your current level of knowledge and understanding, both of the topic itself and of the scholarship around that topic. And it shows us how you think and write academically. It's a little sample of your academic work, if you like. But it is really important to say that the first version of your research proposal that we see might actually not be the final version. And if you're in touch with a supervisor who suggests that you go away and develop it further, that is a good sign and not a bad sign. It's a sign that there's something in it that is going to make a good PhD, and they want you to make it as strong as it possibly can be, because then that is the basis for doing a good PhD. And in particular, if you're applying for funding, then you will need to discuss it with your supervisor and get feedback on your drafts. But let's assume you're a stage further back and you're thinking about finding your topic in the first place from within your discipline. So you need to think about what broad area within your discipline really interests you. And it needs to be an area within your discipline that will sustain your interest through the PhD. And if you're thinking of an academic or a related career, perhaps beyond your PhD as well. And you probably do have an instinct of what area that is. But I do want you to step back a bit from being immersed in the academic arguments about that subject, and actually, before you start writing your PhD proposal, do step back a bit and just think at a really fundamental level, what is it about this that on a human level or on an emotional level or on an intellectual level grabs you about it? And if you were explaining to a non-academic friend, for example, what your subject area was, what would it be that you would focus in on and say really grabbed you about it? And that should help you to find your way towards the key research questions that really drive your interest in that topic. But for a PhD proposal, you then need to, of course, come back into the academic zone and really think about what's a workable case study that will enable you to tackle some of those questions within a PhD thesis. It has to be original, it has to have not been done in that way for that particular topic before, and it has to be viable. You can access the sources you need, you can do it within the 3-year PhD time span. So moving on to what to include in your proposal. And this slide is quite a good guide to the order you can put things in and perhaps some of the subheading you might want to use as well. So do give a nice clear title for your topic, a paragraph then explaining what the topic is and why it matters, just giving some key background. Then move on to your key research question or questions. Then a literature review, a discussion of the existing scholarship, a discussion of the methodology, but also the sources that you're going to use and any theories you might want to use in your PhD. And then you can flesh out the content of your PhD a bit more and look at subtopics with the research questions that you might want to ask that are kind of subsidiary questions to your main question and that might form the core of different chapters. You can include a timetable for completing the PhD, and then at the end, a brief conclusion that should explain what the contribution to scholarship will be from you having done this research. You should include a bibliography, certainly of any references that you've actually referred to in the course of your proposal, possibly of further key reading as well, if you want to demonstrate what you already are familiar with in the literature. And you can include illustrations, but I would mainly do that if it's strictly necessary to understand your proposal. So let's look at those elements in a bit more detail. The research question is the driving force behind a PhD. So you need to have a nice clear question in mind that is the fundamental question behind your PhD. And I would say in your proposal, do actually phrase it as a question with a question mark at the end, rather than saying, I am going to explore the issues of X, Y, and Z. Actually force yourself to phrase it as a question because it makes it clearer to you what the real analytical issues are. Within that, there will be, as I say, some subsidiary questions that you need to answer. And again, you can state those at certain points within your proposal. What's really important is to engage with the existing literature on your topic and on related topics as well to help you to define your own research question. So will your case study answer a question that scholars have already been asking? Have they actually missed an important question? And so this leads us into the literature review, which is a really important part of your proposal. And it's important because you're proposing to do a PhD, you are entering a field of scholarship where there's an existing conversation that's gone on between scholars, perhaps over the course of decades. And you need to show us that you understand some of that conversation, that you can engage with it, that you can learn from it. And that you're going to be able to contribute to it in a way that shows sensitivity to what's already been said, just as you would in any other conversation. You're coming in, you don't just barge in and speak as if no one else has already spoken. So it's really about showing that you're engaged in that conversation, that you're interested by it, that you see lots of positive things in it, and that you want to add to it in a constructive way. So your literature review should show that you know what's already been researched, but not just in terms of coverage, also in terms of the arguments that scholars have made about it. So do paraphrase scholars' arguments when you're discussing their work in your literature review. Don't just say this scholar has covered this topic or this period of history. Be specific, name the scholars that you're talking about and give the date of the work, include that in the bibliography. And ideally, you should be telling a story or making an argument within your literature review, and that requires you to link up the arguments that different scholars have already made on your topic. So do they agree or disagree about a particular question? Has there been a shift in the scholarship more recently to a new set of approaches, for example? So you can group different scholars together. If you have a short word count, you may find that you have to do that anyway to fit in as much as you want to. Coming out of all that, then you can highlight what you're going to build on from the existing scholarship in your research, as well as what you're going to challenge or where you will fill a gap. So make sure you do the positive side of that, as well as the more negative side, no one's done this yet and therefore I need to do it. And show that you're excited about the literature that there is in your field that is inspiring and that you might draw inspiration from as you go on into your topic. And you can also do that by relating your specific topic to a broader field. And if you're working on a topic that hasn't been done much before, you might have to do that. You might have to draw on approaches from a related topic. After your literature review, the next section of your proposal is likely to be a section on methodology and sources. At the most fundamental level, you'll want to discuss the sources or materials you're going to draw on. Where is your evidence for your PhD going to come from? Is it going to come from archives? If so, which archives are they going to be? Where are they? What collections will you be using? Is it going to be interviewees? If so, what's the demographic you're looking for? How are you going to find them? Then you also need to talk about your methodology, your techniques. So are you going to be using specific techniques such as oral history or digital humanities or creative practice, textual analysis? And it may be that those specific techniques also have a literature about them methodologically that you should reference. And the same is true when you then talk about approaches and theories you might use in your analysis. If you're going to use a particular theory, you might want to reference a couple of key authors who've used that theory or talked about it. And all of this adds up to justifying how these methods and theories are going to serve your particular topic well. Then you can break down your topic a bit more and talk about what you're going to cover in the different sections, possibly chapters of your dissertation. Obviously, we all know that the plan of your dissertation may change as you get into it. But if you look at the different issues you're going to cover, again, the sub-research questions that might motivate each chapter, the materials that each chapter might cover. And this can lead into an outline of your dissertation structure, perhaps, or if you need to put in a timetable for completion of your dissertation, again, having a chapter structure can help you to do that. And then moving on finally to how you should present your dissertation proposal, how you should write and present it. The most important thing is clarity. So make sure that your proposal is really clear, really logical. Use appropriate language for your academic field, but if in doubt, keep it simple. Don't try and make your writing more complicated than it needs to be. And in some cases, if you're writing a proposal that's going to go into a funding competition, for example, you might be being read by people outside your subject area. So if you get too deep into technicalities, rather than using slightly more accessible language, that might not work to your advantage. So it needs to be appropriate language for your field. It needs to be academic language, but not abstruse language. Use subheadings where it's appropriate to make the structure of your proposal nice and clear. You can use bullet points for things like research questions, But for something like the literature review, for example, do make sure you're writing in full sentences, because this is a nice sample of your academic writing and we need to see how you do that. Do make sure, just double check that all the scholars and publications you've mentioned in your proposal are included in your bibliography, and make sure that your bibliography is alphabetized, that the references are formatted according to a consistent system and done correctly. Just make sure you give that nice professional impression. And finally, the key advice really is to allow plenty of time, especially for something like a funding competition, where you would also need to check very carefully what the precise word count is, whether there is a particular form that might have other sections that you need to fill in as well. So don't have a last-minute panic. Do give yourself plenty of time. And work with your proposed supervisor. You can find supervisors directly on department websites, and they're very used to being emailed, so you can contact someone directly if they're your ideal supervisor, or you can go via the postgraduate director in the relevant department or school within Reading. So get in touch with supervisors earlier rather than later. And of course, also do get some advice and help with your proposal. Do get someone to proofread it for you. It's wonderful what a second pair of eyes will pick up that you might not have spotted. So best of luck with your proposals, and we'll be very happy to answer your questions a bit later in the session. But for the moment, I'm going to hand over to Andre, who's going to talk about the student perspective.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I have to be honest, I was taking some notes myself on some of the wisdom you shared that certainly will be helpful for future endeavors at my own PhD. Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. I'll be briefly sharing my experience writing a PhD research proposal and some of the stages it took for me to secure funding and also to be accepted at the University of Reading. So just as a disclosure in general lines, I won't be showing you a detailed map about how to achieve your destination, but hopefully I can show you the value of using a compass itself for you to draw your own map whilst navigating those unknown waters of writing a proposal. So before starting everything, my name, as Rachel said, is André. I'm originally from Brazil. You probably can tell by my odd accent, and I'm a final year PhD candidate at the University of Reading. I started my PhD back in 2017, working as a joint PhD student between the School of Biological Sciences and Henley Business School, and I'm funded under a CAPES Brazilian scholarship. So my work is investigating different mechanisms that lock in global food systems into unsustainable trajectories through a holistic and interdisciplinary lens. So in more common words, I'm studying the economic, health, and environmental impacts of food from its production in agricultural settings to its consumption, as we regularly do as citizens. So a bit of my experience. Before starting my PhD in Reading and contacting potential supervisors, I made sure that I made a reasonable search of open calls for proposals, and only after that I focused my energies to work on only a few deadlines at a time. It's likely that you're entering competitive processes, so back then I decided that I'll try my best to focus in quality rather than quantity. So that's where I can possibly share a first takeaway message. And of course, as Rachel have just said previously, prepare yourself ahead. I found, for instance, an excellent opportunity back in 2015. I invested a substantial amount of time back then in writing a proposal. However, I was not selected. Although I felt confident when I submitted back then, I certainly and clearly needed time to learn in areas I could improve. I was only successful in another call for proposals and a proposal that I submitted 1 year later. So in 2016, when I did my best to contact my supervisors with time ahead, Professor Tom Oliver, with substantial time in advance to my application. Back then, I didn't know many academics with a common interest in the area of sustainable and resilient food systems. So I did email academics that published papers I felt not only were robust enough, but also aligned with my core interests. And I looked for those papers in key journals relevant to the area that I was interested in. So that's something important to keep in mind, again, as Rachel said. Potential supervisors are interested in prospect PhD students. So if you contact them about an important paper they have published, you and you're both able to identify key shared values and approaches. This can be a great first step if you don't know much people either inside or outside your country, which I have to be honest was my case back then. But before submitting my full proposal to my sponsor, however, I shared these common ideas with my supervisor in what is called a short research proposal, which is a less than 1 page long document, very succinct, academically speaking, and tailored to my supervisor's interests and also to Reading's potential as a host institution. And the other document that I said was what is generally called the letter of motivation, in which I shared some of the principles and values I try to carry and what sort of journey I would like to take in an ideal scenario as a PhD student, which is much more of a personal document rather than an academic document itself. And why am I saying that? Because even if you're not submitting a research proposal on the foreseeable future, especially under the troubled times that we currently live in, writing these two documents can be an excellent exercise to help you find where to invest your energies. Again, it's much more about mastering the use of a compass than knowing an exact map of your destination. So in this process, after a couple of rounds of back and forth discussions with my supervisors, we came to an agreement of what are the key research questions. Again, this is fundamental, as Rachel said. What are the key research questions of the project and how we would develop it and test it methodologically. So only after this process, I started working in the full research proposal itself. And then I submitted it to my funding agency. So this more traditional, in my case, was a 15-page document with all the elements that not only Rachel just spoke, but Professor Faustina Huang will speak in more details shortly. So about 6 months after that, I got the positive result and started planning my move to the UK. So if I can share 3 humble takeaway messages from my experience, they would be: first one, prepare ahead and be ready to adapt to obstacles. When looking for funders and suitable supervisors, look beyond these methods and research areas. Look for their core interests as academics and what contribution they pretty much are seeking to give to the world in general. For instance, my supervisor has recently published a non-fiction book which I wouldn't be able to find in his traditional papers published. And that's a core piece of work of his that I could find this shared interest. Another idea might be to cite not only academic work itself, but also legislation and international agreements as a part of understanding of your research problem as a whole. So, for instance, if you're researching climate-related subjects, the Paris Agreement for 2016 can be a good example of what to refer. The second takeaway message is quite key in all process, and especially also if you are successful in your research proposal, it will be key during your PhD journey, which is aim to be assertive with your potential supervisor and your funder. So bear in mind that supervisors are extremely busy people. Make the most of the time. For instance, send them clear and polished documents with clear instructions or what you would need from them, as Rachel mentioned. And also do your best to tailor your proposal in order to fit in a reasonable way on how your supervisor can literally support you and then supervise you. So that's very important for you to be assertive in that sense. My final takeaway message is, yes, you are going to be critically assessed on your technical capacities. But please bear in mind that you're applying to take a PhD training. In general, supervisors, again, are looking for potential. So they are understanding you as a work in progress and not as a finished piece of art itself. So do keep in mind that your vision and passion are key to shape your professional life, and that your extremely valuable core principles of a proposal and also of your communication process with potential funders and supervisors. Well, that's it from me today. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope that this can be somehow helpful for you and your endeavors. And again, wish you all the best of luck to write your own research proposals. So next one speaking, the one and only Faustina Juan, Director of Postgraduate Research Study from the School of Biological Sciences.
Thank you so much, Andre. Good day, everybody. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to speak with you about writing a PhD proposal for the sciences. You will hear some common themes that overlap with points that Rachel and Andre have already raised, but there are also some slight differences, I think, between writing a proposal for the sciences versus the arts and humanities and social sciences that I hope will be helpful. So please let me start with a few points about the purpose of the research proposal. And one thing to bear in mind is that one of the most important purposes is that it helps potential supervisors and PhD admissions tutors to know what are your research interests and to identify who in our university is best placed to support you and to supervise this research. It also helps us to plan what facilities and support are required to enable the proposed research. We're also interested to hear what you think are the potential contributions and impact. And finally, as we often receive your proposal as part of our first contact with you as a potential applicant, it's really helpful for us to learn a little bit about you and your current skills and your knowledge, such as your written communication skills and your ability to seek out and to interpret relevant literature. So bearing in mind these potential purposes for the proposal, let me speak then a little bit about how you should structure your proposal. So ideally, your proposal should aim to have a clear title and a clear description of the research topic. We want to hear your ideas about how the proposed research links with that of the university and of your potential supervisor. And Andre has mentioned that as well, about tailoring your research ideas as best you can to fit with what's happening at the university. It's helpful if you can explain your thoughts on what would be involved in conducting the research and what resources will be required. And your proposal should highlight the potential novel contributions and the impact of the proposed research. And finally, make clear what is the motivation for the research, demonstrate your understanding of the literature, and ensure that your research proposal is well written and well presented. So those are some of the basics, but we're mindful that writing a research proposal may well be unfamiliar for many people. And so some starting points are to think about what area of science interests you. What topic could you see yourself working on for 3 years or more and potentially forging a career in afterwards? So you may not have a very precise idea at the moment, but I'm sure you have some general idea of the area. And so to help you refine those ideas, you can research what the university is doing in relevant areas. Look up who are the key people working in that area and try to narrow down and to refine your ideas about what it is that you would like to do. In the process, we really welcome applicants to contact relevant academics directly with some initial ideas, expressions of interest, if you will. And you can start a dialogue about potential directions for taking the ideas forward. And I would like to stress the idea that it is very much a dialogue. So it's often the case that the research proposal is the starting point for a conversation. The potential supervisor may be able to offer suggestions for how to tailor the research to strengthen it or to take advantage of emerging opportunities at the university or more widely in the scientific community. So don't feel that the PhD proposal is a finished product at the point that you share it with us. It's a starting point for that conversation to develop the ideas further. Let me now provide an overview of the general structure of a PhD proposal. And I intend this just to provide an overview of the general structure, but I will come back to elaborate on some of these points a little bit later. A scientific PhD proposal will usually consist of a title. It doesn't need to be too long or too specific, but it should be sufficiently descriptive to give us an idea of what your area of interest is. An introduction and background should cover why is this research interesting, important, and also what are others doing in the field. It's helpful if you can include a statement of your proposed research questions. And again, as Rachel mentioned, phrase these as actual questions with a question mark at the end. These research questions help you articulate what it is that you're aiming to investigate. And while the research questions summarize what you wish to investigate, the methodology section is important because it helps explain how that research will be carried out. Summarize the potential contributions from the proposed research and what discoveries could your research lead to. And we also ask that you include a project plan and a timeline for completion of the PhD in 3 years. And finally, do cite and include references to literature in the field. So I will come back and elaborate on each of these sections a little bit later. Now, regarding how long the research proposal should be, it's important that you check if there are any specific instructions relating to your application. So, for example, some studentship competitions have strict word limits on their research proposals, and it's important that you adhere to the rules. If it's a general application to the university, however, there's normally no fixed length, but you can use 2,000 to 4,000 words as a rough guide. The idea is that we don't wish for it to be overly long, but equally we need enough information to understand what research you're interested in and also how you plan to conduct that research. Word counts normally don't include the title, the references, figure legends, and tables. But again, if you're applying to a specific competition, please do check the rules carefully. And finally, you may be familiar with the phrase that a picture can paint 1,000 words. And so if there's a particular figure or an image that helps to explain the research, and that bit's important, it should be relevant and it should be supporting the points that you're trying to make through your research proposal. And it's not just there to make things look pretty. So if it helps to explain the research, then by all means do include the figure. In terms of writing and presentation, scientific writing tends to be concise and to the point. And so it's worth editing your proposal after it's been drafted, so editing and redrafting to make it as clear and as concise as possible. Avoid plagiarism and be sure to put the work of others in your own words and to reference the work appropriately. Any indication of plagiarism is normally a cause for concern when we're assessing these as potential supervisors or as PhD admission tutors. So please do be careful about making sure that the work is paraphrased and is referenced appropriately. Sometimes we're asked if the research proposal needs to be written in a particular voice, whether that's active voice or passive voice. Both are commonly used, and perhaps what's more important is simply to ensure that your ideas are communicated clearly. In terms of visual presentation, it's really helpful if you make the document easy to read. Please use headings, subheadings, and white space effectively to make sure that the document is clear and easy on the eyes. And do make sure to spell check and to proofread your proposal before submitting it. Now, having presented the general structure of a PhD proposal, I'll continue in a minute to elaborate on some of the sections in a little more detail. But if I can just pause here with this photograph of a PhD student and a supervisor in one of our laboratories in the School of Biological Sciences, I just want to use this opportunity to highlight that we have some absolutely wonderful research facilities at the university across all the science areas. And the University of Reading is also a very friendly place to conduct your research and to carry out your studies. And we've got a really vibrant community within the science schools and also across the university. So I hope you can take this photograph as a reminder of the facilities and of the friendly research environment. So let me return now to elaborate a little on the individual sections of the research proposal. So we start with the introduction and background. So this section explains the what and the why of your research. What is your research about? Why is it interesting and important to science and to society? It should include a brief review of prior work to establish what is known in the area, what is not yet known, and where do you hope to make a contribution. There are many good places to search for relevant literature. You may wish to read publications from the university and ideally from your proposed supervisor to try to work out how your research is going to fit with their interests and with their ongoing efforts. And you can also search for relevant literature in places such as Google Scholar or PubMed or Web of Science. There are many established literature databases. When we read the background in the introduction, some of the things we're looking for is to see if the proposed topic is appropriate for a PhD at Reading. You know, does it match with our expertise? We're also looking to see the level to which the applicant has engaged with the literature and reading to see how the applicant expresses their research ideas. Moving on then to the research questions. So these articulate what you're aiming to find out in your research. In sometimes, but not always the case, the research may lend itself to particular hypotheses that are to be tested. And if that's the case for you, please do include these in your research proposal. And as we read the research questions, we'll be thinking about how well do these questions resonate with our research in Reading, and also what is the potential for these research questions to lead to novel contributions. The method section of the research proposal explains how you plan to conduct your research. Are there particular methods, techniques, or approaches that are best for your investigation? And if so, please do refer to them in the research proposal. Sometimes the research can open up opportunities for new methodologies to be developed. And if there's scope for methodological innovations, you can highlight these in your proposal, and they would be very much of interest to potential supervisors. Make a note of what equipment and facilities may be required. If you need a particular type of spectroscopy or you need access to particular data banks, it's important to highlight that in your methodology section. And if you are aware of what facilities are available inside the university, to the best of your knowledge, make a note of those. And if you will require facilities outside of the university, please elaborate on any ideas or connections you already have that will enable you to access those resources that you need. Think about what experiments you will need to conduct and present those in a sensible order. Or if your research involves building a technical system, describe what it is that you're planning to build. Consider what data will you collect and how do you propose to analyze it. And as we read your methodology, we will be thinking about how feasible is it to conduct this research in Reading, and what other support might be required so that we can start planning how we can put that into place. And we're also looking to see how clear is the applicant at this stage on what's needed. And again, this is all informing this conversation and the dialogue about how to develop the research further. Moving on then to expected contributions. In articulating your expected contributions, there are a number of points that you could touch on. You can be thinking about how your research will advance current scientific knowledge. What do you anticipate to be the impact of your results? Will your research open up new avenues of investigation that others can build on? And you can also comment on the importance of your hypothesis to science and to society. So we'll be looking to see what is the potential for novel contributions to the field and where could this research lead in the future. So this bit is really exciting, I think, for both you and for the potential supervisor, because it's about articulating and thinking about what exciting new discoveries might be possible and what opportunities might lie ahead. We do ask that you provide a timeline for the completion of your research. And so the timeline, if we can move on to the next slide, the timeline helps to show that the project is achievable in 3 years of full-time study or 5 years if you plan to study part-time. And one way to approach this timeline is to divide your project into key tasks and indicate how much time will be required for each task. And often people break it down into chunks of work that can be completed in roughly 3 to 6 months. Do note any important dependencies or milestones. And what we mean by dependency is where a particular aspect of your research can only proceed once something else is in place. And so if your project plan has these sorts of dependencies, then it's useful to highlight these in your research proposal. In terms of how you present your project plan, it could be simply a table or a list of tasks with some dates against them, or a rough indication of how long each task will take. Some people like to present it more formally as a Gantt chart, but the format isn't so crucial here. There's no absolute correct way to do it. What's more important is that the timeline is clear and clearly communicated. So as we look at the project plan, we'll be thinking about if the project is achievable within the time frame, and if it's not, how might we need to adjust it to make it more appropriate? And we are also looking to see a little bit, how are your project planning skills at the moment? And finally, your references. So your proposal should include references, in part to avoid plagiarism, but also to demonstrate your knowledge of the current state of the field. We don't specify any particular referencing style, but pick one of the widely accepted ones and be consistent. So don't mix and match. Of course, you can reference older papers in the field. So sometimes there are some key seminal papers that are really important for your field. So do include those, but it's also important to demonstrate that you're familiar with recent developments of the field. So be sure to include some of the more recent literature. When you're citing papers, cite the original works rather than citing papers that mention the other works. And as much as possible, unless it's to support a general discussion, avoid using review papers and instead refer to articles that are the primary sources of research. And as we're looking at the references, we're looking to see what is the latest research on the topic, and also what is the applicant's current level of ability in seeking out, selecting, and making use of references. So if I can just close then by reiterating that the research proposal helps us to understand where your research interests lie and gives us a sense of your current ability in planning and communicating your research. And in most cases, the research proposal shouldn't be thought of as a finished article. Rather, it's a starting point for a dialogue with a potential supervisor. And we work with you to develop the research ideas and the further opportunities. So thank you very much. And with that, I'm going to hand back to John Lloyd.
Thank you, Faustina. Thank you very much. So I'm just going to summarize, if we could just go back to the previous couple of slides, please. Just quickly drawing some common themes. So very briefly, then we'll move on to your questions. So the length and the format and the order depends on subject of interest. Do have a look at the school and department websites and the profiles, because there's so much information on there about where our expertise lies. It's absolutely fine to contact a potential supervisor by email and have that kind of dialogue similar to what Andre talked about there. That's absolutely fine, although you don't have to do that. Because if you are not sure about a potential supervisor, then that is something we can help you to identify. On the graduate school website, which the links at the bottom of most of the slides there, we have a document providing a kind of template of the different sections that a proposal should cover, and there's also some specific information there for various different departments where there are some subtle slight differences that you would want to know about. So just moving on. If we could have the next slide, thank you. So just ensure you've covered the what and the why and the how and what you're hoping to discover in your research. Do check your spelling and grammar and references. We provide a number of PhD project ideas on the graduate school website, which can be useful as a starting point for a discussion about something around one of those projects. So also, you can actually just apply for one of those projects if you find it of interest. Also, on the graduate school website, there are completed PhD theses which you can just view and just have a look at, which can be a really useful resource for you. And as I mentioned, the graduate school website has got a wealth of information. It's general, but it links out to the schools, but we've got information about funding and other things. So now we're going to move on to have a look at your questions. Thank you for sending those in, and if you have any more, please yeah, do add to those. And there's a slide here also which provides information about other ways you can contact us later, how you can follow us on social media, or if you wish to have actually a detailed one-to-one appointment about your specific situation. So I'm just going to move on to some questions now, and our panel are very kindly going to have a look at these for us. So, I mean, here, the first question, what are the selection criteria for a PhD program? I wonder, Rachel, would you mind starting with that, please?
Absolutely. Well, obviously, we're looking at your past record. We expect you to have a master's in a relevant subject to what you're going on to do your PhD in. The criteria aren't hard and fast, but we're looking at you and your preparedness for a doctoral project, and we're also looking at the feasibility and promise of that project itself. So we definitely need to know a bit about your academic record, and if you're getting in touch with a supervisor on spec, it's useful to say, I've just completed a master's with a merit in history and I wrote my dissertation on this. And then it comes down to assessing your preparedness for the project, but also the nature of the project itself and whether it's feasible in all the ways that Faustina and I have just talked about. But as I say, do also bear in mind, which we've also emphasised, that it's about your fit with the supervisor as well. So you may be a brilliant student with a brilliant project, but the fit might not be right at this particular moment. So we may also give you ideas of other places to take that project that might be a better fit at this particular moment.
Thank you, Rachel.
If I
Faustina,
could
do you
just
want to
add, yeah, a little, that in the UK, this is, I came to the UK as an international student myself, and I think it's an interesting distinction that actually for a PhD in the sciences, you do not need a master's degree. So it's not uncommon that with a strong bachelor's degree, you can enter onto a PhD program. And so in terms of prerequisites, that's something to bear in mind. And also that the criteria and the level of competition can differ. So if you're applying for a funded studentship, for example, oftentimes these are incredibly, incredibly competitive. And so we are looking for people with very, very strong applications. If it's a self-funded PhD and you're applying for a place, then it's normally the fit with the potential supervisor and the fit with the research of the department that would and your potential as a PhD student that would be more important.
Thank you, Faustina. And also, Faustina, while you're here now, could you give advice about a research proposal which a supervisor has listed? So I've mentioned that we've got those on our website, and supervisors sometimes propose projects. How would someone approach that differently compared to a student-led research proposal?
Thank you very much. It's an excellent question. It does vary somewhat. So maybe the first thing to do would be to contact the supervisor or the administrator to ask if it's still necessary to submit a separate research proposal. So some supervisors don't require that. Others, even if they have put out a proposed project, they still like to see the applicant's interpretation of that project idea. And so in the same way that we've been saying your proposal serves as the starting point for dialogue, in some cases where the supervisors put out a project idea, they intend that to be the starting point for a conversation. So if it's kind of in the right area of interest to you, but there's some bits that you're not sure about, normally you can have a conversation to see how it can be tailored or tweaked to fit your strengths and your interests in a way that is still in line with what the supervisor is trying to do.
Thank you. Andre, maybe you could respond to this question, please. So we've been asked, when you contact a potential supervisor, what is an appropriate message to send? And I'm wondering whether you might be able to say how you contacted Professor Tom Oliver that very first time, what you said, what you included in your message, and how you did that.
Exactly. That's a fantastic question, because I did have a couple of email drafts before sending them in the first place. So in my experience, I found it's extremely important for you to show this clear link between your interests and the interests of the supervisor. And also don't be too specific. Try to open up a bit for those values and principles that I've mentioned before. So for instance, I've generally asked him what kind of, if he would be taking new PhD students, what kind of interests he would be looking for, what kind of values he really thinks are important for his research group, where does he was seeing himself in the next 5 to 10 years, and so on, because that not only helps you to identify those values for that particular point when you're submitting your thesis, but most PhDs will be around for a while. So also identify this trajectory that makes sense for you in the long term.
Thank you, Andre. Another question which asks about co-supervision across different universities. So if you've got a supervisor at Reading, is it possible to have a supervisor at another university? And the answer to that's yes, but Rachel, I wonder whether you might be able to talk about sort of how that works and at Reading.
The obvious example of it working at Reading in Arts and Humanities is the South Western Wales doctoral funding consortium where you're expected to have a supervisor at 2 different institutions. So if you're in the arts and humanities or interdisciplinary with one subject in the arts and humanities, that's a really interesting opportunity where it will be automatically part of your application that you would be supervised across 2 different universities. And I think that tends to make the process of co-supervision across institutions much easier, that it's built into the scheme. And if you're putting in an application for that scheme, then I would definitely contact both the Reading supervisor and other potential supervisors early on, but also ask the advice of the person you've contacted at Reading about who might be appropriate supervisors elsewhere, perhaps people they might be actually in contact with. It is possible also to have co-supervision in other circumstances, but I think it tends to be bureaucratically a bit more difficult, and I think you'd need to make a really good case for why that's the ideal supervision setup to have.
Thank you. Thank you. Another question, is there a specific process for proposing an interdisciplinary area for a PhD? Someone who's interested in working between history and biological sciences. So maybe either Faustina or Rachel, would you be able to comment on how we would do an interdisciplinary project, please?
Shall I start? I think I'm looking at the questions. I think this is from Claire, who I'm also in contact with. So that's. I think you probably do need to decide what your lead subject is, and take it from there. And we have quite a lot of students who have a first supervisor in history and another supervisor in another department, but they're listed as doing a history PhD program. And I think that would be probably the most obvious way to do it if you have a clear sense of which is your lead subject. But I don't know whether Faustina wants to come in on that as well.
I fully agree. So I think it's important to recognize that you will need to be registered with one department, as it were, as your primary, the department that's going to award your degree. But the actual process of developing the research ideas and the research proposals, I think, is not any different, actually. You still prepare the same research questions, introduction, background, methodology, references, and you still develop that dialogue. But I would also stress that Reading is a wonderful place to do interdisciplinary research. Andre, as you'll see, is co-supervised across biological sciences and Henley Business School. I myself have had PhD students co-supervised between biomedical engineering and human nutrition. And so, it's a wonderful place that supports interdisciplinary research, but there is this practicality that you will be registered for one particular department.
Thank you. Another question that I think is about whether there's a template of a proposal for certain subjects, and I think that's probably something we need to look at developing. Sort of a good practice proposal looks like this, but I think this is kind of covered by the materials I've mentioned on the graduate school's website, where we have a guide on how to write a good research proposal in terms of the different different sections that should be added there. It's what we've covered today as well. And certainly also you can look at the thesis I mentioned earlier that we have available for you to view online. So that's certainly something you could look at doing as well. A question about an American master's degree, whether that would be considered. I think that I would ask our admissions office about that, but certainly if it's equivalent to a UK master's degree, that would be acceptable. I don't know whether our panel would like to comment further on this at all.
I would just leap in and say, sorry, our student can come after me. I'd just leap in and say that we look at the appropriateness of your trajectory up to this point in in a fairly flexible way, but we also look at equivalencies and how different degrees from different countries compare with each other. But certainly I would be very happy to look at someone with an American master's degree. There are circumstances, Faustina's already said this for the sciences, but for the humanities as well, there are circumstances where you might waive the normal requirement for a master's degree or take someone who'd come through a slightly different route in terms of coming in from a slightly different discipline. So it's always worth having the conversation with the director of postgraduate studies in that department and with the supervisor about whether you would need to go away and do a master's or a more suitable master's, or whether they think that you have the skills already to embark on a doctoral program.
Thank you. Yeah.
I fully agree, and just to echo that there's not just the one path into a PhD. There are some, different options. So please don't be shy to approach us and to ask us about your particular circumstances.
Yes, and just to add that it is possible to undertake a PhD in the science areas without actually having a master's degree. It isn't a specific requirement, and a number of students do progress straight from a good bachelor's degree to a PhD there. A question about can a supervisor write a reference letter for us? Andre, would you be able to talk about that one, please?
Yes, of course. So again, it's a pattern I consider. Also depends on the process itself. So from my experience, my sponsor would require letters of reference from 2 different academics, which were not my intended supervisors. So in this case, I did contact my former supervisor in my master's degree, and I had contact with an American academic as well, and they were very kind to write reference letter. But it's quite important for you to check all the specific criteria for any application that you're making, because some of them will require a reference letter and some of them wouldn't. I would just make sure not to include the reference letter from the same person that you are intending to take as the supervisor itself.
Thank you. Thank you. Do we have a question? Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, let me just come in on that and say that actually certainly in my subject area, the references, what's important about the references generally in my subject areas are that they come from someone who has taught you and supervised you as you've gone through the process that leads up to the PhD. And if you're proposing to do a PhD with someone who supervised your master's thesis, actually it can be appropriate to have a reference from that person for your PhD, even if you're applying for a funding competition. Certainly if you're applying for a place at Reading as a self-funded student, it's quite common to have a reference from the prospective supervisor under those circumstances, and that's a very appropriate person to write that kind of reference. But as Andre said, you need to check the particular sponsor or particular requirements in case it's not allowed in a particular case.
Thank you. So a question also about somebody whose bachelor's degree is not brilliant, but the GPA of their MA is a distinction. Would that matter? Faustina, would you be able to comment on that?
Yeah, and I would just echo Rachel's earlier comment that often we look at the trajectory. So if the more advanced degree is showing a stronger, and the more recent degree is showing a stronger result, that would be taken into consideration more so, I would say, than a previous bachelor's degree. And we all accept that people have, room and opportunity to grow.
Thank you. So I think we're coming to the end of our webinar now. Just one thing about a copy of the slides or the recording. This is available or will be available to you after the end of the session in the follow-up materials that you'll receive. And also, I just wanted to mention about something called a PhD by distance as well, which is something that is offered by the university where you receive remote supervision through Skype or by Zoom or some means like that, and it allows you to start your PhD when you're away from the university, and that might be something you've always wanted to do because of your circumstances. It's quite flexible, but also in a situation where you might not be able to travel to the UK, then is another option to enable you to start and then to travel to the university when that's more easy for you. So we've come to the end of our webinar today, and we hope that you found it helpful as you look to develop your research proposal. And we'd like to thank you for joining us today. And I'd like to thank Rachel, Faustina, and Andre for their helpful advice today. So thank you very much.